Hi there, and welcome to the Carpenter's Desk. Today we are joined by Dr. Justin Bass. Welcome, Dr. Bass.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so Dr. Bass has a PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary and is currently the professor of New Testament at Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary. And we'll be talking mostly about Dr. Bass's most recent book, The Bedrock of Christianity, The Unalterable Facts of Jesus' Death and Resurrection. It is an excellent book, especially if you are interested in apologetics and historical aspects of Christianity. And I highly recommend if you read the book, and you could pass it on to your non-Christian friends as well, who might be, interested in historical facts of Christianity. Dr. Bass, please tell us a little bit about yourself, your ministry, and what motivated you to write this book.
Yeah, thank you again for having me on. And I've been actually living in the Middle East for the last 3 years. I've been professor of New Testament at Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary in Amman, Jordan. JETS for short, since it's a mouthful. But really an excellent school. It's been around since 1991. The president, Dr. Ahmad, actually graduated from the same school I graduated from, Dallas Theological Seminary. And he graduated there with his PhD in 91 and went back to Jordan. He's from Jordan. He's Jordanian, and he started this seminary, and it's just been an incredible, really miracle in the midst of the Middle East, having approval from the government, and really probably one of the largest Christian seminaries, evangelical seminaries in the Middle East. And so I teach there all kinds of courses: theology, apologetics, New Testament. I'm also serving refugees, so I work with Syrian and Iraqi and even Yemeni refugees, Muslim and Christian refugees. Both of them have been persecuted by ISIS and had to flee Iraq and Syria and other places and came to Jordan. And so I work with the NGO helping serve them, and then I also serve a number of churches there, just preaching and serving. I served as an elder at one, and so just doing a number of things to see the kingdom advance in this part of the world where Christianity began. Christianity began in the East. It began in the Middle East. So we want to see the name of Christ lifted high there again.
So what was the motivation behind writing such a book? What motivated you to write this book?
Yeah, so really, I would say the number one reason I wrote The Bedrock of Christianity is really a personal reason. It's kind of my own most convincing case for the resurrection. It's what convinces me. It's what convinces me that Christianity is true. And really, I came to Christ in college about 20 years ago. And so for the last 20 years, I've been doing nothing but building on that evidence, that historical powerhouse evidence for the resurrection. That's always, from the very beginning, that has been really what led me to Christianity and led me to Christ. And so this is kind of a book of 20 years in the making of reading, different scholarship, different apologetic books, different all kinds of books on the resurrection, unbelievers' challenges to the resurrection, other religions' challenges to the resurrection. And so in studying all the things that I've studied on the resurrection, I kept noticing these certain historical facts that are agreed upon across the board by whether a person's an atheist, whether a person's an agnostic, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, liberal, conservative. It didn't matter what faith background they had. Even Muslims who delved into these subjects would agree on these facts. Like, for example, Reza Aslan wrote a book on Jesus not too many years ago. Popular book on Jesus, terrible book really, but still a popular book on Jesus. And but he admits that Jesus was crucified, and of course in Islam they deny the crucifixion because the Quran says he wasn't crucified. Someone else was crucified. But yet Reza Aslan claims to be a Muslim, but still accepts the crucifixion because the historical fact is just so bedrock. And so examples like that, I kept seeing all these facts. And so I wanted to have them all in one place. And so that was one of my primary goals with this book, to have all the bedrock facts agreed upon across the board by credentialed scholars all over the world about Jesus, about his early movement. And so that's what I wanted to do in this book, and just have it all in one place. And I think those bare facts that everyone agrees on, I think leads us to the undeniable truth of the resurrection, like Thomas saying, "My Lord and my God," at the feet of the risen Jesus.
So, Dr. Bass, could you just explain, as you've slightly touched on the topic of bedrock facts, what are these bedrock facts? Like, how many of them have you considered as bedrock facts, and what are the criteria that you have used, in getting these facts, like to call them as bedrock facts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm following just basically, the agreed upon historical critical method that's been used for, the last 200-300 years to discover certain facts of history. Again, we're not dealing with 100% certainty. This isn't the same as mathematical facts, but as far as across the board, what people agree upon by using sources, using the critical method of studying archaeological facts, all kinds of things. When you put it all together, there's certain facts of history that we can say this happened. We can say Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. We can say the temple was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans under Emperor Titus. And we can say a number of things. And so there are many bedrock facts as well with Christianity. I actually list them at the end of the book, but the main, they kind of break out into two categories. One is the bedrock sources that I focus on. So the sources that are agreed upon by everyone, and this would be mainly Paul's early letters. So there are 7 today that across the board, all scholars will agree Paul wrote, and the historical information in those letters are reliable. Paul is not lying to us, and he is not deceived. He is telling us the truth about his movements and about things that he mentions in his letters. And these would be Galatians, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon. But then even if you narrow that down, I really focus on the 4, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, and Galatians. Those 4, really just those 4 alone give us the bedrock facts that I focus on. But those are our bedrock sources. And then even traditions within those letters that Paul writes, he quotes that go back even earlier. We might talk about that later. But that would be the bedrock sources. And then the bedrock facts I narrow down to really 4. I lay them out as 4 bedrock facts that deal with the resurrection. And that would be the crucifixion, as I said, even like Muslim scholars like Reza Aslan agree on, the claim of the resurrection, so that the earliest followers of Jesus believed Jesus rose from the dead. And they were claiming that the resurrection that Jews believed in at the time that would happen at the end of the world has begun in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. He has died on a cross, but he has risen from the dead, being the first fruits of the future resurrection. An incredible, innovative, unparalleled claim. And then the third one would be the appearances, so that Jesus appeared to a number of individuals, men and women, believers and even an unbeliever, and even a large groups of people. And then the last one is so undeniable, you can't deny it, like you can't deny the sun is in the sky. And that is that the Christian movement began in Jerusalem in the early 30s AD, same place where Jesus was crucified, and that movement has gone on to, I think, prove to be indestructible. Many times it has been, so many the people and nations have tried to destroy it, the Caesars, the Ottoman Empire, go down the list, communism. There's been so many movements that have tried to destroy the church. And again, they have failed. And so this movement has proved to be indestructible, and it has gone on to be the largest religion in the world. So that's the fourth bedrock fact is the movement that has exploded from Jerusalem. It's been launched from Jerusalem after Jesus' crucifixion. So those are the 4: crucifixion, the claim of the resurrection, the appearances, and then the indestructible movement.
Yeah. So, Dr. Bass, so these are the facts that are basically agreed upon by all scholarship, like as Christians and as atheist, agnostic, all these people who study New Testament, they all these professors or like proper scholars, all of them agree upon these facts, isn't it?
Yes, and I make sure and I say teaching scholars, credentialed teaching scholars. So professors that are actually, they've been vetted, so they've been hired. They serve on a faculty somewhere, Yale, Princeton, Oxford, Cambridge, go down the list. They all agree on this. So this doesn't include, of course, just anybody who can write a blog, anybody who can just, type in a comment on YouTube. anybody that can just post a Facebook post or tweet out a tweet. There are people all over the internet that say ridiculous things. So we can't say that, nobody agrees on everything on anything. There are people even who deny the earth is round, things like that. So we can't say across the board just anyone, but as far as the experts, as far as the people who are credentialed, who are teaching scholars, full-time professors across the world, they agree on these facts.
All right. So one thing that we focus on is the creed, and as we know, that the creedal tradition is so important. And when we read 1 Corinthians 15 verse 3 to 8, which you are focusing on your book, how do we know that these are actually pre-Pauline in nature? What are the methods that we use to date this particular passage much earlier?
Yes. So when we think about Paul's letters, so Paul's letters would be, I said, that the bedrock material, the bedrock sources we're using. But what I really call the bedrock source in the book is this, what many scholars have called a creedal tradition or a formula. They use different language, but basically it's written in this creedal way, like we think of the Nicene Creed, like we think of the Apostles' Creed, the creeds that came down to us much later. We have actually a creedal tradition that goes back to the earliest days of the apostles, that goes back to the earliest followers of Jesus himself. And this is in 1 Corinthians 15, as you mentioned. And we know this because Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3, he says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." Now, this is very agreed upon to be transmission type language, the transmission of tradition. This is the language that Jews would use. We see it in the Mishnah, for example, that dates to around 200 AD. We see this language in Josephus, who was a Jewish historian writing right around the same time as Paul, a little bit after Paul. But this language of "I delivered, I also received," what I also received, I delivered unto you, is this language of transmitting tradition. So what's this tradition Paul has transmitted to the Corinthians? We know he planted the church of Corinth around 49, 50 AD. And when he did that, that's when he gave them this creedal tradition that he quotes, which talks about how Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. And then he appeared to a number of people: Peter, the 12 minus Judas, of course, more than 500 people at one time, James, Jesus' brother, to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me. So Paul adds himself to the creed. But so he would have delivered this to the Corinthians when he planted the church, and the dating on that is around 49, 50 AD, give or take a year. And then, so that means he received it sometime before that. So when did he receive it? So I found across the board, scholars basically have two options. They lay out two options for this. Either he received it right after his conversion near Damascus from the Christians there, which would be somewhere around 34, 35 AD, or Paul received it when he went to meet with Peter and James in Jerusalem, as he tells us in Galatians 1, 3 years after his conversion. So this would be around 37, 38, somewhere around there AD. So either way, we're talking about in the 30s AD, within less than a decade after Jesus' death. It is undeniable that Paul would have received this. And then if he received it then, it was organized, it was put together earlier than that. So this is why, as I show in the book, scholars across the board, you could say, give or take 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death, this formula that we have about Christ's death, burial, resurrection, and appearances was formulated probably within about 2 to 5 years, could be as early as months after Jesus' death. An incredible thing, unparalleled in the ancient world when it comes to having sources this close to an event. Other than a person actually writing about it, like Josephus writing as a eyewitness to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Other than something like that, this is the best you get when you can get this close to an event within months, within years of an event.
So even if we are going by a liberal dating, we have to date it within a decade of, this creed has to be within a decade after Jesus' death, isn't it?
Yes, at most a decade. 5 years is on average where most date it.
All right. So, just out of curiosity, is there anything that is, you just pointed out that there, but what is the closest thing, in ancient history that we can actually, uh, stack to the creed? Like, is there anything else that is so close to an event in all of history?
I mean, there's probably others. I wouldn't be able to probably give you the best of the best just right off the top of my head, but the one that comes to mind that I do talk about in the book that I think is a good parallel to the study of Jesus historically is Socrates. So the philosopher Socrates, he had 3 disciples who wrote about him, who knew him, and they write about him probably within 15 to 20 years at least after his death. And they could have been, like I think maybe Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, might have been writing some notes during Jesus' sermons while he was alive as well. So some people could have been writing things while Jesus was alive in the same way. But with Socrates, we have disciples like Plato, like Xenophon. We have disciples writing within about 15 to 20 years after his death. So interestingly, scholars of ancient philosophy, scholars of Plato, they use the same language that scholars of the New Testament of Jesus talk about. They'll talk about the historical Socrates. So what they mean by that is they're saying, okay, the picture that Xenophon gives us of Socrates is a little different than Plato. So which one's giving us the true historical Socrates? But these are both beloved disciples. They love Socrates. So they're both clearly giving us a different vantage point, a different view of who Socrates is. So I think from those sources, I think we can gain a lot of solid historical information about Socrates. And I would say, add that times 1,000, you have that much more historical information on Jesus, because we have 4 biographies just full, an embarrassment of riches on him. And these, I believe, are all sourced in eyewitness testimony. So I like to compare Socrates, because we do have such solid early historical information about him from his very disciples, written very early, still not as early as this creed, but still pretty early. But when you compare to other, leading figures of the ancient world like Buddha or Muhammad or, Confucius, when you look at those guys, we're talking about hundreds of years after the fact. Are people now writing about them and giving us biographies about them? With Buddha, I think it's like 500 years after. It's just ridiculous that we could even say anything definitive of who the historical Buddha really was and what he said and what he did. But very different when it comes to Jesus, and I would say Socrates. We have solid historical information for Socrates.
All right. So, I've heard this kind of argument that in your book, you're actually talking a lot about Paul and his writings. So, there are maybe not scholars, but at least there is this allegation that Paul was, responsible for inventing the Christianity that we know. And
yes.
So Paul was not a disciple of Jesus. So these ideas are, Paul's own ideas. It's not from the apostles. So as a New Testament scholar, how do you respond to this kind of allegation?
None at all. Yeah, it's a ridiculous thing. And thankfully, fortunately, most of the top guys out there, like Bart Ehrman, for example, who is clearly no ally of Christianity, who's written a ton about Paul, a ton about Jesus, a ton about the early Christian movement, and he is in no way even entertaining this option. I mean, this is something that you'll find, again, this is the kind of thing you'll find in the YouTube videos and YouTube comments and people that just really are ignorant of the history. And the main reason we know that is because Christianity, one, already had begun, the movement had already begun before Paul. For one, Paul was persecuting it. So what movement was Paul persecuting if he started it, if he began Christianity? He is persecuting that movement. So that movement that had spread all over Judea and in many other areas had already begun. But also another example would be Rome. The churches in Rome that Paul writes to, he had never been there. So we see how Christianity has spread to the heart of the Roman Empire without Paul. Paul had nothing to do with the churches in Rome. And that's true probably about Alexandria. That's true of probably all kinds of areas that started to become dominant with Christianity in the first century. But we also know this just historically with Paul himself, because we know Paul knew Peter, James, as I mentioned before, the brother of Jesus. He knew people of the 12. He was in Jerusalem, or he knew Barnabas. He was around the earliest followers of Jesus in Jerusalem within years of Jesus's death. This is just undeniable historical bedrock. And he tells us, Paul tells us, and everyone agrees, he's telling us the truth, that what he's preaching is what they're preaching. They're all preaching the same thing. And it's not just from Paul saying that. We also have Acts. We also have the Gospels. We also have 1 Peter. We also have the letter of James. So we have all these independent mini sources that are all agreeing clearly on the atonement of Jesus, on his death for our sins, on his burial, on his resurrection, and on the fact that he's appeared to many people afterwards. So yeah, this statement, this claim has no basis in real history. Paul and the earliest followers of Jesus are all preaching the same thing. Paul just happened to be, I would say, probably the most successful church planter, missionary of the early church. There's no doubt about that. He was definitely the most successful of them all, and accomplished probably more than all of them. He even says that in one of his letters. But he is in no way inventing. He is just carrying on the message that had started years before his conversion.
All right. So, one of the things that you mentioned is how Christianity has contributed to the world, be it literature, be it art, be it music, and all the good things that has happened over 1500 years. Maybe can even credit Christianity for its role that it played in modern science, the development of modern science. But given that there are also evils that have been done in the name of Christianity, the church have done it, people have done it in the name of Christ, the crusades that happened. And even if you look at from an Eastern point of view, colonization could be viewed as a problem of Christianity. So how do you think that, how can you actually compare? So if you look at the good that has been done, there is also evil that has been done.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So what I would say is, when you talk about the evils done by the church and done by Christians that have been leaders, that have been tyrants, especially this really begins post-Constantine, for the first 280 years of the church. So from the cross to Constantine, which is exactly 280 years if Christ was crucified 33 AD, and Constantine stopped the persecution of Christians in 313 AD. So for that first 280 years, the church spread by love, by sacrifice, by martyrdom. Christians, there's no record that they killed one single person, that they did anything, of these evils that we hear about a lot throughout church history. Now, post-Constantine, all bets are off. Now Christians get in power, and when people get in power, as we know, Christians are sinners like everybody else. That's why we needed a savior. And so Christians in power, whether it was the British Empire, or whether it was medieval Europe, or whether it was Constantine or Theodosius, Christians did evil things. And I would be easily willing to say, and we should say as Christians, whatever evil has been done in the world, Christians, people who claim to be Christians, have done it too. So the evil, I would say, is on the same level with everyone else. So here's the argument I'm making. I'm making the argument of the good and the true and the beautiful that the movement has offered. And that's where I would say Christianity now stands out from all the other religions and worldviews and anybody else. So instead of comparing their evil with our evil, I would say we're the same. Our evil is as bad as anybody else's evil. But when it comes to the good, I would say ours is better. I would say ours, what Christianity has inspired the greatest things in the world. And I list a lot of those things, and I could go through them example after example. But, poetry, let's just start with poetry, go across the board, Dante, John Milton. I mean, who's the Dante of Latin America? Who's the Dante of the Middle East? Who's the Dante of, Dante, people from all different viewpoints that are teaching literature, that are teaching poetry, will say Dante is the greatest of poets. There's no one greater than Dante. Well, who inspired Dante? And I would say you could do that with Bach, with music. Who's greater than Bach? And who inspired Bach? And you can do it with art. people would say Da Vinci's Last Supper, is one of the greatest paintings of all time. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. And all this was inspired by Christ. All this was inspired by the truth of the scriptures. It was inspired by Christianity. And like you said, the scientific revolution, where did the scientific revolution happen? It didn't happen in China. It didn't happen in Latin America. It didn't happen with the Aztecs. It happened in medieval Europe. And there was a lot of evils that medieval Europe was still doing at the time. But we have to ask the question, why did the advancement of science happen? And they were all Christians, Galileo, Copernicus. I mean, you just read their writings. They were all strong Christians. So that would be my argument, is that the resurrection of Christ, the beauty of Christ, the teachings of Christ has inspired more good, the true, and the beautiful in the world than any other movement could ever claim, any other worldview, any other religion. So I'm comparing our best with their best in that sense. So that's kind of the argument. But again, I wouldn't say this is a bedrock fact. The bedrock is the movement of Christianity that originated in Jerusalem, that's gone on to be the most dominant movement on the planet. And then as a side point to that is, look at all the good and the true and the beautiful that this movement has contributed to the world. If Jesus rose from the dead, if he is Lord of the world, it makes sense that he would inspire the greatest music, the greatest art, the greatest literature, the greatest poetry. He should do that. And that's, I think, what he has. That's really the argument that I'm making with that.
Yeah. So again, moving on to the resurrection part of the book. Of course, there was resurrection appearances. Of course, you cannot deny the fact that the disciples saw something that appeared to be the risen Lord. Now, if you talk about resurrection, what were the ideas that existed, pre-Christianity, what are the pre-Christian views, I would say, about resurrection in the ancient Jewish world, or in the rest of the ancient world that was, like, for example, the Greek idea? What were those ideas, and how is the Christian idea of resurrection different from all these ideas?
Yeah, this goes to that fact, the claim of the resurrection of Jesus. That this is absolutely unique in the history of ideas. So the Jews did believe in resurrection. So they had this idea of a bodily revivification, that the corpse of human beings, the righteous and the wicked, would one day rise again. The spirit would reanimate the body, the corpse, and even the dust, and they would rise and stand before God at the great final judgment. Now, this is really what Daniel is prophesying in Daniel chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. He says, "Many who sleep in the dust will rise, some to everlasting shame and contempt, and others to shine like the stars in the heavens, that have led many to righteousness." And so that passage is kind of a foundational passage for resurrection. So we see this with the Maccabees. The Maccabees, the story of the Maccabees is written in two books, First and Second Maccabees, about 100 years or so before Jesus was born. And in that book, in those books, we hear about resurrection. Even some of the people who are martyred, they're about to be killed, and one of the guys puts his arms forward and he says, "Cut my arms off, because I'm going to receive them back at the resurrection." So they believed in this future bodily resurrection. And Josephus testifies to this. We see this testified in the New Testament. Some of the Jews didn't believe, like the Sadducees. They didn't believe in a future bodily resurrection, and they even had that debate with Jesus about it. So that was the common view of the Jews, is that there would be this future bodily resurrection of the righteous and the wicked at the end of the world. But what the Christians claimed is that this man, who we believe to be the Messiah, who was crucified, he has risen from the dead. He isn't just like the Maccabean martyrs. He isn't just glorified in heaven, exalted in the heavens, and true martyrs in the heaven. He's not just a great martyr in heaven. They could have said that, but they didn't say that. They said he rose from the dead. What Daniel prophesied has begun in this man, Jesus. That is unparalleled. And where did they get the idea? Nobody had this idea. And so when it comes to the Greeks and the Romans and people of other faiths and these other mystery religions and things, they denied bodily resurrection. All the evidence that we have is that they knew about the Jewish idea of resurrection, but they denied it. They did not accept that we would be, have this bodily resurrection in the future. They believed in the immortality of the soul, or the transmigration of the soul, or something like that. Kind of clearly some mixing with reincarnation ideas that probably came from India and from other places around the time. So there is a book that I recommend everyone read. I actually have it near my elbow. Triven Medinger, The Riddle of the Resurrection. This is considered to be the definitive work on dying and rising gods in the ancient world, what that means, everything about that. And what's so cool about it is he basically says, he concludes that there are only three what he calls dying and rising gods that fit this seasonal pattern that the pagans believed before Jesus, that you could actually date before Jesus. But he still spends the last section of his book explaining how Jesus's resurrection is absolutely unique. Absolutely unique. For one, Jesus was a human being. All these other gods are legendary, gods like Romulus or something, somebody from the ancient past. That's clearly just some legend. It's focused on a historical event. It's focused on a crucifixion, an empty tomb, something historical that you can actually date. This is not true of these other cases. And also, as I said, the dying and rising gods was based on a seasonal cycle, but Jesus' death and resurrection was a one-time event. It happened once and for all, not based on some seasonal event. And also just the atonement idea that Jesus died for our sins. None of these other dying and rising gods died for sins. So there's really no parallel to those at all, to the Christian claim, to the Jewish claim of resurrection. He has just this great discussion of that and makes that point at the end of the book.
So even in the Jewish idea, there was probably they did not think about a dying Messiah who would die and then would get resurrected, isn't it? So that was a fresh idea.
Exactly. Yeah. So they had, that's the thing. They had views on the Messiah. They had views on resurrection, but nobody had the same idea that the Christians did. The Christians put all those together in this unique mutation. Is how one New Testament scholar had put it. It's this strange mutation of belief. Yeah, they expected the Messiah to triumph. They expected the ones who did believe in a Messiah that was to come. We have some writings before Jesus about this triumphing Messiah in this book called Psalms of Solomon. He would be this Davidic warrior. He would conquer the Gentiles. Even some of the Jews who paraphrased Isaiah 53, they changed it from the Messiah suffering for the sins to punishing the Gentiles. So this was the more common Jewish view, was that the Messiah would triumph. So for him to be crucified, this just absolutely meant that someone was not a Messiah. And then the idea that he would rise from the dead in the middle of history, and then everything would continue going. There was nothing about that. Nothing. Resurrection and the Messiah did not come together at all in these parallel writings. So yeah, it's an absolutely unique idea. And so who came up with it? Where did they get the idea? You're telling me Mary Magdalene came up with this? You're telling me Peter came up with this? A fisherman came up with this? I mean, that's what you have to believe. If you believe Jesus stayed dead, you have to believe that these original followers of Jesus just came up with these ideas that have gone on to transform the world. Incredible.
Even they were not expecting that Jesus would be coming back to life, even though Jesus had mentioned about his death and resurrection. But, isn't it? They had no idea that after 3 days, he's going to literally come out of the tomb and present himself before them.
Well, that's a fun one. Because yes, in the Gospels, what's interesting is we're told at least 3 times, probably during that last journey to Jerusalem, Jesus started to tell them that he would be delivered over to the Jews and the Romans. They would, punish him, spit upon him, crucify him, and on the 3rd day, the Son of Man would rise again. Now, one thing you can do on that is you talk about, if you're talking to unbelievers, you could say, okay, so did Jesus really say that? So pressure them. If they're going to assume Jesus said that, then okay, you have to admit that Jesus predicted that he would be crucified and that he would rise again. But separate from that, does the statements each time when it talks about this prediction, It always makes the point in the Gospels, and the disciples did not understand this word. The disciples did not know what he was talking about. So that's what I think. I think Jesus did tell them that this would happen, but it was such a foreign idea that the Messiah not only would be crucified, but also rise again, and the resurrection is just this one individual. It's not the future. It's not the end of the world. That idea was just so new and fresh, and they had never heard of such an idea that they really didn't understand it. So I don't think they grasped it until Jesus actually did rise from the dead and appear before them and explain it to them, as he spent 40 days, we're told in Acts, doing so. So that's the way it makes sense to me.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I would like to ask is, as we, kind of close this interview, is about something that you've mentioned in your book, and I think you've done a fairly good job in, explaining it. But when these historians, they look at these facts, they always come with this, idea of presupposition called as methodological naturalism. So they would rule out any possibility of miracle. You mentioned about Bart Ehrman, a few minutes ago, and he's someone that you have been regularly quoting in your book. He's not, although he's not a believer, but a lot of the things that you state as bedrock facts, he's actually believing all those things did happen. But then when it comes to the resurrection, um, these historians, they would not accept a miracle to explain these facts. Now, is this idea flawed? And if it is flawed, how would you respond to it?
Yeah, I think it's extremely flawed. I like the line by, I don't know if you heard Dinesh D'Souza ever in any of his debates. He's debated a lot of atheists, and he turns the line around to them and talks about how they believe in the atheism of the gaps. The atheism of the gaps, because basically if you don't accept that a miracle could happen, like that God could create the world, or that Jesus could rise from the dead, or that anybody could be healed, then no matter what the evidence says, no matter how clear the evidence is, you'll always punt to the atheism of the gaps. You'll always say, no, it has to be something else. It can't be the miracle, because miracles don't happen. So I think this is extremely flawed, and it really is just closed-minded. I think we should have an open mind. I think, going back to Socrates, we should follow the evidence where it leads, even if it leads to strange and scary places. And this is scary for a lot of people, because if the supernatural does happen, then the entire worldview for a number of intellectuals and a number of people in this world crashes down on them. And this is why I quote, my theme of the whole book, as you saw, was from Hamlet, from Shakespeare's Hamlet, and where Hamlet tells his skeptical friend Horatio, who is just in bewilderment that Hamlet's father, the ghost of his father, is appearing to people, but it's undeniable because he's seen it. He's seen it himself. And he says, Horatio says, "Oh, day and night, but this is wondrous strange." And Hamlet says, "And therefore, as a stranger, give it welcome. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." And I love that, because I think Shakespeare is saying, really, to his readers through Hamlet, he's saying, expect the unexpected. Welcome the strange and extraordinary. If your philosophy is not wide enough to include the miraculous and the extraordinary, then you need a new philosophy. And so anybody who follows that kind of rigid naturalism, they need a new philosophy. We should be open, even as Christians, we should be open to the miraculous in the ancient world, in modern day, but we should always say, what is the evidence? We should look at it on a case-by-case basis. And we should say, okay, so what is the evidence? Let's look at the evidence. And we might even see, because if the Christian worldview is true, then we know there are other supernatural forces other than God in the world. We know that there are demonic hosts. There are other things that do powers. Janus and Jambres, the magicians in Exodus, was doing some kind of supernatural things to try to imitate the plagues for a while, and then they got ultimately defeated. But clearly there are supernatural things happening in the world outside of, not outside of God's will and God's power, but by beings that God created that are supernatural, that are supranatural, that are not natural to this earth and to our physical world. So we should be open to these happenings, and we should look at the evidence. A good example I use from church history would be Joan of Arc. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the same level of evidence of the resurrection, but I don't know if you've heard of the story of Joan of Arc. But I mean, here we're dealing with a 17-year-old girl that claims to hear voices from God and Jesus, and she's told to go to the King of France and tell him that she's going to lead his armies to defeat the English and that France will be free from then on. And she's an illiterate, peasant, poor, 17-year-old girl. She does this. The king is convinced by what she says to him, and she leads army after army to victory as a 17-year-old girl. And so I look at that, and again, that's all just bedrock facts, bedrock evidence. And what does that conclude? Are you telling me that she did this naturalistically? Are you telling me a 17-year-old peasant girl just happened to be the only teenage girl in the history of the world to lead armies into battle, and she did it all by her own strength, by her own power? I mean, no, I think this demands the supernatural. I think voices did speak to Joan of Arc. I think the evidence leads to scary places. So I think we should follow the evidence where it leads. We should look, there's tons of miraculous claims, even in the Christian church, throughout church history, that I don't believe because there's no evidence, or the evidence is very late, it's not trustworthy, or it's biased, or so we should just look at the evidence on a case-by-case basis. And when it comes to the evidence of the resurrection, I would say that's the strongest case that can be made for the miraculous, for the supernatural in the history of the world.
Okay. I just want to, out of curiosity, apart from the resurrection, like being the true explanation of the facts, apart from that, do you think there is any naturalistic explanation that can come close to that explanatory power? Like any of the hypotheses that you have come across, would do justice to at least not all, but would do justice to at least most of the facts. Do you think there is any of these naturalistic explanations that can do?
I don't think so. And I really, of course, people would say I'm biased. I'm a Christian. I believe in the resurrection, but I mean, it's just befuddles me that even some of these ideas are even put forth as possible answers. I talk about in the book, and I've shared in other interviews and discussions, that the one option that I do respect that people give, and really Bart Ehrman has leaned more towards this, at least in his more recent books, and that's just, I don't know. just a cautious agnosticism, an agnosticism of, okay, all the evidence does shout miracle, and it probably goes back again to this, methodological naturalism, presuppositional, presuppositions about miracles and things, but they just, put their hands up and say, I don't know. I at least respect that, because that's really how the apostles approached the miracle and the miraculous claim the first time they heard it from the women. Luke and others tell us, that when the women proclaimed the resurrection to the apostles, they thought they were crazy. They thought they were delirious. They were insane. They don't know what they're talking about. So I think we should be loving and gentle and patient with the skeptic, and seek to demonstrate the evidence. And I think it'll plant seeds, and they may be the way the apostles were at first, but down the road, the Lord may bring them to themselves and give them the same kind of convincing evidence that he gave Thomas. And that's what I believe. I believe not that Jesus will appear to everybody like he appeared to Thomas, but I think he'll give the true seeker what he gave Thomas. He'll give him the equivalent of what he gave Thomas. If anyone truly seeks, they will find. But yeah, the other explanation, the hallucination is the only other one that really is used today. And I talk, and you saw I talk about that in the book, and how the claims of Jesus's resurrection appearances are unlike any hallucinations we have on record, and they've been surveyed ad infinitum. So and it just doesn't ever explain the unique claim of the resurrection. Even if you think that there was some hallucinations involved, where did they get the idea of resurrection? They would have got that. They would have said, like the Maccabean martyrs, that Jesus had been exalted, that Jesus had been, glorified in heaven. He's our great martyr. They would not have said he rose from the dead in the middle of history. He's the first fruits of the final resurrection, and a number of other things. So yeah, I don't find anything that explains these bedrock facts anywhere close than the resurrection itself.
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Bass, for this wonderful insight that you've given us. We went through a lot of things that you actually mentioned in the book. But I believe when one reads the book, it would be a really excellent read. There will be a lot of things to explore, and I would leave a link to the book if you want to buy it, or in the description box. And once again, thank you, Dr. Bass, for your time, and it was wonderful having you at the company's desk. Thank you.
This is a wonderful conversation. Thank you, brother. God bless you.